Now I would say this order makes everything he can to give us younger markers, what kind of text he intends to write. This is about things that have been fulfilled, that events that has happened, that were seen by people, so they are eyewitness information. And this writer, he himself, has carefully investigated into those events and those eyewitness reports, and he has decided to, in some kind of chronological order, write it down, and he assures that the information he gives is certain. Now, of course, he can be a liar and everything can be false. I'm not denying that. But the younger here, what the author intends to write and wants us to understand is that he would like to write about historical events that took place, and that this is a result of historical investigation. That is the genre. Kogahammer and his view is today also outdated. It's not only a misunderstanding, I think, of, for example, the introduction of the Gospel of Luke. It's also, in terms of New Testament research, an outdated view. During the last few decades, there has been a great change in the understanding of the Gospels and what kind of texts there are. This is a quote from Richard Burridge and his book, What Are the Gospels? A comparison with Greco-Roman biography. And Richard Burridge is one of the leading New Testament scholars when it comes to the genre discussion. What kind of literature are the Gospels? And he writes at the end of his book this: the identification of the Gospel genre as a type of Greco-Roman biography has now become the consensus among New Testament scholars. So the Gospels are today viewed as a subdivision under Greco-Roman biography. They want to present and introduce a historical figure and tell things about his life. When were the main sources about Jesus written? How close in contact with Jesus are they? Jesus' public ministry was around year 30. The Gospels in the New Testament are all first century writing. They were all completed before the year 100. The standard dating is that the Gospels were written from the 60s to the 90s, beginning with the Gospel of Mark. It's possible to give an argumentation for an earlier dating, but I go with what is today the standard in New Testament space. It means that it was about 30 years between Jesus' public ministry and the first written account about his life. Now, let me tell you something really scary. I remember what happened 30 years ago. It's true. Of course, a lot of things that happened 30 years ago I've forgotten. A lot of things I have just a very vague memory of, because I've not thought about it for 30 years. Other things I know in detail and can retell in detail because it's been so important in my life. And I've been very often been thinking about it and talking with other people about it. For example, 30 years ago, I met my wife. There are a number of events I could tell you. What we did and what we said and what happened and so on. When the Gospel writers started to write down the stories of Jesus, it was not like after 30 years one day they had it. Oh yeah, in my younger days I met this guy Jesus. Oh yeah, I should write something down. No, what they were writing down was something that they verbally had talked about for 30 years. And we know today, and this is due especially to one Swedish scholar, Birger Gerhardsson, a New Testament scholar. He has shown very convincingly how strong the tradition, or how strong the tradition in Judaism was that a rabbi taught his disciples his message. And the disciples memorized the teaching and could then give the same teaching verbally. And it was the responsibility of the disciple not to change or add the teaching, but deliver faithfully what he had memorized from the master. And this is what the first Christians did. They had high view of Jesus, they saw him as their Lord and Master, and they learned from the beginning his teaching. They memorized it. And you know, in antiquity, where people could not rely on hard disks, the ability to memorize was so much more developed within many individuals. So they memorized things, and then they talked about it for 30 years. And then finally they also wrote it down. So we have it in written form. Here's a big difference between the New Testament Gospels and the Gnostic Gospels that Brown, for example, refers to. The Gnostic Gospels were written during the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th century and are almost without historical value as a source for Jesus of Nazareth. The writers have never been in Israel, they know nothing about Judaism, they have never seen or heard or known Jesus. And what they are writing about is purely speculative. Do the Gospels have personal contact with Jesus? They're close in time, but how close are they personally? Here I'm following a very interesting book, a new book, by a New Testament scholar, Richard Borkham. It's called Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. Richard Borkham says that there are good arguments to say that the oldest, the first Gospel, the Gospel of Mark, actually, in terms of its content, comes from the Apostle Peter. There are 3 arguments. The first is that the church father Papias, around 115 AD, he tells about Mark and says that Mark was the translator, the interpreter of Peter. And that when Mark wrote down his gospel, he had the content from Peter. So actually, in the Gospel of Mark, we have Peter's story written down by his interpreter, Mark. Secondly, there is a hint of this in the Gospel of Mark itself. It has been shown in other texts from antiquity that an author could give a hint of where he had his information from by making what is called an inclusio. That you named a certain individual as the first named individual in your text, and then you put the same individual as the last named individual in your text. And that was a sophisticated way to say to your reader what stands behind those 2 namings of this individual comes from him or her. And you read the Gospel of Mark, the first named disciple is Peter, the last named disciple is Peter. It forms an inclusio that the information comes from Peter. And thirdly, if you try to read the Gospel of Mark, you will see that Peter is more frequently mentioned in Mark's Gospel than in the other Gospels, as if written from a kind of Peter perspective. So it makes really sense in relationship to the text to say the content comes from Peter. Now this is highly interesting. If this is true, we really have information from the close circle around Jesus. This was his main disciple and one of his closest friends. It's hard to imagine any more interesting source of information about Jesus of Nazareth than Peter. In addition, the Gospel, they have the ring of truth. With that I mean, they are interestingly honest about things that were really embarrassing for its authors and for the leadership of the early church. You know, we know in our time the strong temptation to Photoshop a picture. You know, there are things you don't like about yourself, and you can make some changes. That's wonderful. We who can edit texts, we have a strong temptation to cut out things that are not really positive about ourselves. Now the interesting thing is when you read the Gospels, you will find a very honest picture about Jesus' disciples and their failures and their mistakes. How Peter, for example, denied Jesus, and how they all were cowards and fled when the soldiers were coming. It's obviously, in my view, that the first church did not Photoshop the Gospels. It seemed like they were really wanting to tell the story as it was. And the sad fact is that his disciples on many occasions were quite confused, and at a number of occasions did the wrong thing. And then they tell it. That's the way it was. To summarize, the Gospels, the main source about Jesus of Nazareth, they are, in my view, honest historical sources about Jesus. The genre is biography. They're close in time to Jesus, 30 years if we follow the standard dating. It's possible that they may be even closer in time. They are close personal to Jesus. The information comes from eyewitnesses and from some of Jesus' best friends who really knew him. And I think it's possible to answer in affirmative the question I began with. Contact with the historical person, Jesus of Nazareth, it's possible. We have a source material that puts us in contact with him. And now, of course, when this lecture is over, all the really fun thing begins. Who was he? What was his teaching? What did he stand for? How can I understand him? And my time is gone. Tragic, but true. But I think it's really important to lay this historical foundation. And if what I have said is right, then we have really good reasons to actually study the sources and make an investigation into who was this man that has influenced our culture so deeply. How can I understand him? I would like to end by a longer quote from English crime writer Dorothy Sayers. She was also a very sharp theologian. And when she studied the original source material about Jesus from Nazareth, this is the picture of the man she got. The people who hanged Christ, never, to do them justice, accused him of being a bore. On the contrary, they thought him too dynamic to be safe. It has been left for later generations to muffle up that chattering personality and surround him with an atmosphere of tedium. We have very efficiently poured the claws of the Lion of Judah, certified him meek and mild, and recommended him as a fitting household pet for pale curates and pious old ladies. To those who knew him, however, he in no way suggested a milk and water person. They objected to him as a dangerous firebrand. True, he was tender to the unfortunate, patient with honest inquirers,